Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you about this project, which is part of my Open Research Fellowship here. And I will thank all of my collaborators at the end. So what was I trying to do in this project? So what I wanted to do was to take one of the key elements of transparent methodology, patient and public involvement or co-production, where we hear from people with lived experience of the condition such as Parkinson's, and they can help us research the most relevant elements of their condition and help us recruit and carry out ethical procedures. So these are often people who become very experienced in advising on research, but what do they know about open research practices? So the other kinds of responsible methodologies that we've been hearing about today. So the overall aim of my fellowship is to share open research principles with, I've called them public contributors, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. So the aim of the study that I'll be telling you about is to find out what public contributors with lived experience already know about open research and what they'd like to know, with the goal of informing some training materials for public contributors. So my research questions then are what, if anything, do they already know about open research? So does the term open research mean anything to them? And how important do they think the different open research practices are? And are they interested in knowing more? I've got a secondary question, which I won't have time to go into today, but looking at different kind of subgroups. So I faced two key challenges in terms of setting up this research. So the first, which I've already alluded to, is that there's a lot of different terms used for these partners who work with us within research. So they might be called public contributors, they might be called patient and public involvement volunteers, co-production officers, co-designers, co-creators, experts by experience. Do let me know if you know of any others. We had to choose a term for the study, so we went with public contributor with lived experience because we felt this was most inclusive. And we also explained what we meant by the term, which I'll come to shortly. The other challenge that we had was a kind of chicken and egg scenario. So if you're asking someone, do you know what open research is? They might just go, no, and then it's a very short survey. So we needed to then explain what the practices were to people. So what we ended up doing, and it's sort of almost started to be a bit of a journey towards the training resource, was that we took the 14 key open research practices which have been used in this recent study, asking researchers, do you do these practices? It was because we felt 14 was too many, we slightly reduced it to 11. And for each practice, we created a plain English summary of the practice. And then we created a fictional vignette around that to try and illustrate the practice to someone who perhaps wouldn't understand the more abstract language of describing practices, which I think can be challenging even for researchers sometimes. And really following on from some of the conversations earlier about kind of talking about questionable research practices and the kind of crisis messaging around science, what we didn't want to do is to create mistrust in these members of the public who are kindly advising us on how to conduct research. So we went with a very positive message in the way that we talked about these things. And many of my collaborators are themselves public contributors, so I was able to get some feedback early on in terms of the kind of vignette. So I won't read through all of this, but this is just an example of looking at the defining the data code. So I created this kind of fictional vignette of a person looking at blood samples and talked about how they got permission from the participants about how the data would be stored in advance of the study. We went with fictional vignettes because we also didn't want to cause any concern if someone read a vignette around their health condition that they had experience of. They might be like, why don't I know about this study? Or, you know, to cause any issue there. So how did we recruit participants to our study? So one of the issues around terminology is that we didn't want people who had taken part in research as a participant to take part in our survey. We were after a very specialist group, those who were public contributors, who were effectively collaborators or advisors on research. So we recruited via gatekeepers, so charities that work with public contributors or researchers. So we tried to essentially recruit the people who run groups so they could recruit their group to the study. And that meant they could also translate our terminology into their own language. So I gave them an email with the survey link, but they could refer to the people as the lived experience panel or whatever they would call themselves. Right. So sorry, I'm going to have to speed up just a little bit. The survey had 3 key parts to it. I won't go through all of the questions, but the first one asked them about their type of public contributor experience, so we could confirm their eligibility at this stage. The second part, which is the most important part, is it had we first of all actually asked them an open question saying, what, if anything, do you know about open research? And they could write anything in that box. In retrospect, we should have also had a yes/no question, but we didn't, unfortunately, do that. But we've got lots of data about what they thought. And then for each of the 11 practices, they rated the familiarity, importance, understandability, and whether they wanted to know more about it. And as you saw on the previous slide, it was quite wordy reading through those, so they could also listen to a lovely recording of me reading them out as well, if they preferred. We also asked a few additional questions. They had an open question about each practice as well, and we asked them some further questions about open research as well. And then finally, we added the demographics at the end. I should say, actually, the audio recording was suggested by one of our public contributors, and I think was really helpful. And another helpful suggestion was to add the more basic demographic data right at the end, because that's something that survey participants and probably even yourselves get a bit fed up of answering. And if people were going to stop our survey, we wanted them to do that right near the end. So how did we go in terms of recruitment? So we, if anything, we were perhaps a bit over stringent in determining eligibility. So 32 people started but were deemed not eligible. And we clustered people at high levels into these different groups of lived experience. Important to highlight that we also had carers represented there. The miscellaneous group were people who didn't tell us, or there were only 1 or 2 people with a particular condition. So the important element is 64 people completed at least one of the open research practice questions. So it's those people whose data I'll be telling you about today. And we pre-registered our analysis as well. So what kinds of public contributor experience did they have? So people could tick as many of these as they wished. So some of them had taken part in focus groups, surveys. Quite a proportion had been co-authors on journal articles, and different, you can see some of the different elements there. They were also highly experienced in terms of years that they'd spent in the role as a public contributor. So it's interesting to reflect that some people have been working in this role for more than 15 years in some cases. They're also 73% had received training in their role as a public contributor, and 31% and 20% had received research training in other domains, so in other parts of their life, within their education or as part of their job. And several had several types of lived experience. So a couple mentioned contributing their ethnicity in terms of advising about research. So, sorry, I'm going to have to zip through some of this. So in terms of what does open research mean to you, this question, quite a few people said they had absolutely no idea. And one person even said, I had to Google it immediately. I won't dwell on this slide, but there's some themes that really come out in terms of what it means, I think, to us as researchers. So some of their comments were already very insightful at this stage. But perhaps more important is telling you about what they thought about the different open research practices. So I'm going to show you a few graphs like this. The little dots represent an individual person, and they're color-coded according to their group. One of our public contributors said you can think of it as people wearing different coloured hats, looking down from above. So we can see that in general, people where they're rating how familiar the different open research practices are. So 5 is highly familiar and 1 is not familiar at all. So generally, a high proportion of people were highly familiar with the different practices, but you can see some of these were very new to people. So you can see preprints were a lot of people were not familiar with those, and also open software and reproducible analysis. So the ones highlighted were significantly lower than some of the other practices. What about how important they thought the different open research practices are? And this is really encouraging because they thought in general they were rated of high importance. So an awful lot of people are clustered at the 5 level. But interestingly, although they were also unfamiliar with preprints, quite a few people thought preprints were less important, as well as pre-registration. So obviously these are things that public contributors don't know very much about and perhaps don't think are important. How understandable are the different open research practices? Now, this was quite encouraging for me in terms of the vignettes and the explanations that we had created. A lot of them rated the practices as understandable, but they queried more, interestingly here, that open software and transparent qualitative methods were rated as lower, as well as preprints, again, coming out here. In terms of wanting to know more about open research practices, this is slightly lower across the practices, but still a lot of people were in the 4 to 5 range. And for this, there were no significant differences between the different open research practices. In terms of some of the questions that we asked them about further training and knowledge, this one really cheered me up because they really more than 70% agreed that they knew more about open research after the survey. So it wasn't designed as an educational package. They already knew a bit more. And one of the comments that stands out to me is someone saying, you know, I can use this straight away. And again, a high proportion agreed that knowing about open research is important as their role as a public contributor, someone bringing their lived experience to advise on research. And more than 70% were interested in further training about open research. I will skip over the demographics very briefly, but just to say one of the things that encouraged me is that some of them were highly educated, so 13% had a doctorate, but it wasn't that they were all PhD level. So in conclusion then, many open research practices were familiar to public contributors, even if they didn't know the term open research. And as I've just said, their practices were viewed as important and important for their role. Generally, they found that the different open research practices were understandable, and more than 70% said they knew more after the survey. So I think this will be very helpful in using some of this as a basis to create the training materials. We're analysing some of the open comments still. So some queries had been identified in the comments, particularly around wondering about the issues of sharing information early through preprints. And there were quite a few queries about the sensitivity of data sharing, which I think are going to be picked up in tomorrow's session. And many of them said they liked the fictional examples. Many wanted to know more about open research and were open to further training. But we should note that these are a highly experienced group of public contributors, so perhaps not completely reflective of contributors who might have not received any research training at all. So what's next then? We're creating some online training materials which we will plan to make openly available. And my vision for this is to really empower public contributors to ask about open research. So my dream is that a person with Parkinson's on a panel for a research project would say, you've had these unexpected findings, but how will other researchers find out about them? So a little bit like some of the antibodies work mentioned in the previous talk. And they will know about some of these practices and can perhaps encourage researchers to think about some of these things at an early stage. And we will hopefully be working with the artist there to create some of the materials. And thank you very much to my wonderful team who've helped me with this.
Thank you, Ellen. That was fantastic again. Have we got any questions for Ellen? Oh, Stephen, someone put the hand up just at the same time as you, but yeah, okay. Thank you.
So as you said, the cohort that you're talking to already have quite a lot of experience of participating in research. And do you get the sense that if more people knew about open research as a kind of standard or a practice within the research community, that actually that would help recruit more people to clinical studies, to creating research? Is there an opportunity that we as a research community are not yet harnessing as well as we might?
I think so the good thing about training the people who are already quite trained as being public contributors is they might help us talk to prospective participants, and that, I guess, the taking part in maybe sensitive research where you might be worried about data sharing, they can help us communicate better. But I think also it makes it seem more worthwhile, you know, if I'm going to go and spend time giving my blood in a study, to know that that could then have a broader benefit, so long as I know that I'm consenting to that happening, is really powerful as well. So rather than just being you giving up a few hours of your time, it could have further impact down the line. So I think absolutely, but we have to be careful about creating trust, I think, through these processes. So
thank you. And I think Judith had a question. Yeah.
Hi. No, I was just going to say, do you think that by training up contributors and people who are about open research, they're actually going to hassle the research team to make sure everything's open and say, so where is it then? Tell us where it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I want to happen. And so it's almost like nagging, but from a different direction. So perhaps rather than, you know, I guess it's good saying to researchers, you've got the moral imperative to do this, and if you don't, it's bad for science. But it can be very powerful and grounding anyway, working with public contributors, and for them to say, well, you know, you've got these unpublished findings, how's someone else going to find out about them? That's really powerful.
Okay, I think we're up to time now. So if we could say a big thank you again to Michael and Ellen.